So hello and welcome everyone to the second iteration this year of the Financial Wellbeing International Student Workshop. Thank you all for joining us today. We are so excited that you're here, and this event is hosted by University Life, Student Financial Services, and ISSO as part of our State of Wellness Days programming. We like to open today's event by looking at the 7 dimensions of well-being. As you might have already seen on this graphic, if you're able, there's a career, emotional, financial, intellectual, relational, physical, and spiritual dimension to your well-being. While this event certainly does aim to provide space for the financial dimension, you might actually find that during this program, you relate more to the relational or intellectual dimensions, which highlights the diversity within and across your well-being journey. So I invite you all to keep these dimensions in mind as we go through our workshop today. Lastly, I am so excited to hand it off to our presenter, Trista Kaiser, Manager, Financial Aid, Operations and Training at Student Financial Services, to get us started. Also, want to remind folks that this event is being recorded, and the recording and materials will be sent out to you in about 2 weeks, most likely coming from Antonia. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to our presenter.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, hello, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. If you're local, then good afternoon. I had to check and see what time it was. For those of you that haven't had the opportunity to sit through a session with me, my name's Trista, and as Unisha mentioned, I am the Manager of Financial Aid Operations and Training within Student Financial Services. Good news, no quiz on the title. I'm very, very happy to have here with me my colleague Maria Reynoso, who is the Director of Compliance for the ISSO office at the university. She's also one of our great partners in this initiative in developing this content and making sure that we're giving you information that's appropriate for you and also a valuable resource to you as a student. So Maria, thank you so much for being here. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and as I'm going to share my screen, I'm going to start off just by asking kind of, what you're hoping to get out of this session here today. If you want to pop something in the chat, if you have any kind of really just general questions to start off with, if it's something we can answer, we absolutely will. If not, the promise I make to every one of my students in any session that I hold is that if I can't get you an answer today, I'll get you an answer or a resource by the time the materials go out. So know that that's the case. But so that I don't trip and chew gum and fall down, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as you guys are telling me a little bit about what you're hoping to learn here today. And of course, if the answers were not sure, that's totally okay. I know financial wellness can be a little bit, interesting for some of us. We don't always think about finances and wellness together. I do see we had some feedback about looking to build a little bit of a credit score as an international student. That's actually a pretty common question that we get. One of the nice things is the presentation that we recorded a little earlier in the summer does touch on some of those topics. So we have that there, and you'll be getting resources for that today. And we'll talk a little bit about it in some other contexts as well. So thank you for sharing that. In the meantime, go ahead, think of your questions as we go. I'm going to go over a brief agenda as to what we are going to chat about today. We're going to talk a little bit about financial literacy, financial wellness, as well as what financial well-being is. I tend to start every presentation I do off with that just because it's important to realize finances and wellness go hand in hand. We're also going to talk a little bit about savings, earnings, and some cultural considerations in that context, as well as educational financing as an international student. And then probably the best part, giving you some really great resources, including information related to iGrad. Now, if you've heard of iGrad, awesome. If you haven't, I'll share what it is. It's the university's complimentary financial wellness and education resource for you as a student here at the university. It's available to all non-affiliate Columbia students just by creating your account at columbia.igrad.com using your school email address. Simple, 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 easy peasy. We'll also be giving instructions with the presentation materials, so you have that for later as a reference point as well. As far as engaging today, we have a few places to kind of stop and go for questions. I do try and answer them as we go. So if you see me kind of looking to the side of the screen, that's why. I just want to make sure I'm not missing questions on anybody. Also, if you prefer to kind of work with us a little more anonymously, you'll see there's a QR code on the screen, and actually there's a QR code at the bottom of almost all the slides that we have today. That's actually to the platform Slido, and that lets you ask questions without having to provide a name, and there's also some other back and forth that we may use that for today as well. With that being said, we will go ahead and actually get started. So I know that we talked a little bit about the 7 dimensions of well-being, right? Unisha was kind enough to share that we have our spiritual, emotional, intellectual, physical, social, environmental, and then all the way down at the bottom, financial, right? So when we put financial next to some of these other areas, it seems a little bit kind of obtuse. It doesn't fit there terribly well, right? Financial feels very tactile. It's numbers, it's math oriented. However, our finances are very closely tied to all of these other dimensions, right? If we were going to think a little bit about something like social, sometimes we might not be able to kind of get to that social well-being if our finances can't get us there, or we could be in a really good place because we have the resources that we need to go ahead and make the choices that we want to. So we can kind of start to see how they influence each other. For a more literal definition, we can look to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and they suggest that financial wellness is a state of being where you have control over your day-to-day and your month-to-month finances. You have the capacity to absorb a financial shock. You're on track to meet your financial goals, and you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy life. So that last little piece right there is where we really start to feel that wellness kind of feeling, right? That warm and fuzzy thing that we get when we have that state of wellness, so we can start to see how that plays into things. However, we don't just get to that place, right? It takes a little bit of work, and that's where financial literacy starts to come in. It's really just your path to financial wellness. It's a set of skills that encompasses knowing when and how to find reliable information to make a financial decision. You'll notice it doesn't say memorizing that information. I certainly don't, and nobody should. Things change very often. It's always good to go look for the most current resources. Knowing how to process financial information to make sound financial decisions, not just any decision, but one that makes sense. And knowing how to execute financial decisions, adapting as necessary to stay on track. So looking at them two next to each other, we have financial literacy is knowing, and financial wellness is having, right? So we can see that we need to bridge the gap a little bit. And that's where the last piece of the conversation in financial literacy comes in, that we see at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. In addition to that knowledge component, we have to really think about putting it to action. We can't just have skills, we have to actually use them. So a lot of the resources that you'll get today are related to, 1, building that skill set, but 2, having tangible action items that you can utilize. So when we think about financial well-being, there's kind of some really great metrics for assessing that information, right? First and foremost, the S&P 500 does a relatively regular survey, kind of analyzing a little bit about what financial literacy looks like across the world. They use it based on a couple of different questions related to things like investments and credit, all those areas we think about in relation to our finances. Without going through it entirely, we can see that there's some patterns here, right? The countries with the highest financial literacy rates, they're all kind of mostly Western Europe and pretty well-developed countries. We can see that they're doing relatively well, between 71% and 63%. Moving kind of more towards where we are today, Mexico is at 32%, the US at 57%. So in the US, we are not by far and large the smartest people with financial literacy. Interestingly enough, there are no countries in South America where more than 50% of people are financially literate. I thought that was a very interesting statistic. And in Africa, there's only one, and it's Botswana. So we can see that there's a lot of variances related to financial literacy around the world, which is why we have these conversations, right? And it starts to play into our cultural understanding of finances as well, which we'll see as we go forward. Now, continuing on, another statistic that was fascinating had to do with kind of the idea that location may not be all that really goes into this conversation, right? Thinking again about Asia and the Middle East in particular, we have some standouts in that area. The vast majority of those countries were relatively low on the scale, ranging between about 28 and 18%, as you can see on the screen. But Myanmar and Bhutan in particular, they had these kind of stellar over 50% rates in comparison, giving their proximity to these other areas, right? Which I thought was really fascinating. So what that tells us is that it's not geographical explicitly, right? There's some type of lines that make a difference in this conversation. And that's why we're going to start to talk a little bit about culture in this context. So what exactly is culture, right? Very, very literally, it's those customary beliefs and values that ethnic, religious, and social groups transmit fairly unchanged from generation to generation, right? It's the stuff that really builds who we are, if we think about it, right? It's not something we're born with necessarily, but the influences are absolutely there. With that in mind, we can see how that can play into our life every day, right? First, culture's reflected in the meanings that people attach to various aspects of life. Also, their way of looking at the world, okay, and how they act within the world, their role in it. Certainly in their values, meaning whether they think of something as good versus evil, right? And in their collective beliefs, really what is true and what is false. And our artistic expression, there's so much beautiful artistry around the world that really does depict the way we understand life very differently. To that end, it also really does influence the way we understand finances and more explicitly investor behavior, right? This is where we kind of want to think about culture as an influential factor through financial socialization. And when we say, culture, there's lots of different cultures. We have our immediate family unit, people like our parents, our family, and those community members around us that set our expectations and kind of guide our experiences. We also have the familiarity of things like religion and how that influences our values. And of course, for all of us that have come to the city relatively recently, how different some of those values can be. I'm sure we've all kind of found that out. And then, of course, being new to the area for some of us, there are some language barriers. And that's not just because we don't necessarily have a lot of fluidity in a language. It's just that we don't always refer to things the same way, right? And that changes the way we contextually understand some of the information that's being presented to us. So what does that have to do with money, right? Well, let's think about what money really is. Very simply, right? It's something we use every day, but it does a little bit more for us societally, right? It's a store of value, right? It creates a metric for us to understand the value of something. It's a medium of exchange, right? A dollar or whatever your currency happens to be represents that unit of measure that we can then trade for something else. It's just a different version of bartering, if we want to think of it that way, okay? Money fills these essential roles in an economy, which makes it useful for executing transactions using items, that financial unit of measurable value. So that's kind of the literal definition. But what does that really mean, right? Money, in very simple terms, has to do with influence, right? Whether it's an influence on you or influence you make on other people. In this context, I know that one concern we've heard from our students as of late has to do with inflation. I know that's a really difficult thing to be working through right now. And when we talk about inflation, it really is just a measure of the rate of change in the average price level of selected goods and services over time, right? So what it cost before isn't what it costs now. And what it costs now isn't what it will cost later. That's the whole concept. The reason it's important to track this information, I know we all kind of hear inflation and we don't think about it as a historic precedent, right? But it is. It's not just something that moves forward. By tracking it, we can get a much better understanding of the way that it really just varies and changes the way we live our day to day, right? So first and foremost, it influences cost of living and how much our dollar is worth, or our current purchasing power, right? One of the tools that's available to us to kind of better understand this information as consumers, meaning people that buy things every day, right? We have our consumer price index, and what that really represents is the year-over-year change from the same month in the prior year for a basket, which really just means category, of commonly purchased goods. You'll see things like food, transportation, medical care, entertainment, among several other things, just those more basic items we think of in our purchases, right? Now, on the other side of that, when we talk about inflation, that can also result in us paying a little bit more in interest over time for anything that we borrow, right? The reason for that is there's a relationship between the way that the economy and inflation work, in that whenever we want to try and get inflation to slow down a little bit, we raise our interest rates. It's meant to keep people from having all of this extra money and creating supply and demand that cycles up. Okay. And it also can influence things like investment performance. Again, anytime we talk about investments, it's reactionary, right? We know there's a lot of things that go into the conversation related to investments, how we react to the information that comes to us. So as things change with inflation and the economy, those outlooks can ultimately change the way our investments work, because we as people respond to it and make changes. It's not all bad though. There's positive influences here as well, right? So when we think about inflation, consumers are more likely to purchase now during a period of inflation or really gradual inflation to avoid paying higher prices in the future, right? The idea being, again, what we buy today costs what it costs today, and the presumption is it's going to cost more tomorrow. And if our income doesn't continue to match that rate, it would be a benefit to us to buy it sooner, and we'll see consumers do that. In the short term, again, it can create those additional retail sales as people feel like they have a little bit more money and there's goods to buy. And that's kind of what we see happening with inflation on that front. Now, on the other side of it, having that kind of gradual inflation also reduces the risks of deflation when prices fall due to economic downturn, right? It's really just the inverse of what's happening at the beginning of the conversation, right? Instead of consumers being willing to go make purchases in the interest of potentially saving money, they'll wait, right? It could be that that's going to change for them, and they may not be working as much as they had been. Labor practices change in periods of deflation. So these all kind of go into the conversation of how money is influenced and influences us as individuals. Now, inflation, of course, has been a struggle for a lot of us. And one of the more common questions that we get has to do with, what can I really do about it, right? How do I think about my finances in this context, right? One of the things that you can do to help cope with rising prices and higher interest rates is called calculating your personal inflation rate, right? So a lot of the time we'll listen to the news, watch the news, whatever it happens to be. We'll hear kind of just these inflation numbers that come through. And we have to remember those are aggregate, right? Sometimes they're national, sometimes they're based on different regions or the world in general. We always want to be thinking about us in our finances, specifically our individual expenses and the way we understand our money, because again, we're all so different that we're not all going to think about it the same way. Your personal inflation rate is meant to help kind of anticipate that information being different, right? Basically, what you do is you subtract the total monthly spending from a year ago. In this case, it would be September from the last month that we completed. And then you go ahead and subtract it from your current month spending. That's why we use September. We haven't finished October yet. You divide the sum by your monthly spending from a year ago, and it results in being able to calculate that rate. So if, let's say, we looked at September of last year and our spending for that year was our spending for this month was $4,500, I should say. The year before it was $4,250. We have a difference of $250. And then we divide that by last year's amount. That means we've seen an increase or our own personal inflation rate at 5.9%. That just means that the expenses that we had were an increase of 5.9% over a year. How that can be helpful to us is we can see how those changes have happened historically and then try and anticipate what's going to happen moving forward, looking at the way that we've spent our own individual money. Now, with that being said, there's kind of this context of short-term versus long-term kind of outlooks, right? When we think about our immediate needs, for a lot of us, we might start to see that affordability has gotten a little more difficult than it used to be related to inflation. You want to try and think about your costs with the focus being on those things that drive inflation, right? What's making your life more expensive? Well, things like energy, housing, food, those are where we're seeing the biggest increases. So if we're looking to try and combat inflation, that's where we want to try and reduce our costs. They go hand in hand. We also want to make sure we look to our spending plan or our budget, whatever document or tracking mechanism that we have, and what's kind of outlining where we want to go in the future, and make sure that we're not short-sighting ourselves, meaning that we're not cutting expenses in areas that is going to detriment our goals and our needs later on, right? Rising prices today mean those costs are just going to be higher tomorrow, so you don't want to sacrifice, if you do not have to, some of the things you're already planning for in the future. You also want to watch out for things like lifestyle creep. This is a really unique niche to students that are now coming to a university that maybe is out of the country and they've never been to before, especially in a place like New York City, right? There's so much out there. And just, I know for me, the first time I walked off the subway right in front of the campus, my goodness, the feeling that just hits you as you do that, right? It's so easy to get engulfed by the world that we live in. However, stick to your grounds, right? You know what's important to you, and it can be a challenging environment to kind of uproot yourself and be in a new place. We want to make sure we're not letting that place change the narrative of our finances. And then lastly, you want to be flexible. This is so important. We have so much pressure on us as students coming into either school for the first time or coming back to school in a different place, in a different way. we don't want to set rules for ourselves that can't be changed because we're just adding extra pressure, right? The goal of this is not to come up with a fixed measurement of what we need to do. The idea is that we need to be flexible, look at the information that's available to us and adjust as we need to. And know that there's guidance out there. There are several different types of professionals that exist within the financial industry, including those that can assist with tax questions, those that can assist with financial planning questions, all the way down through insurance and real estate. So where your questions exist, there are qualified professionals to help. And one of the resources I'll be sharing with this presentation has to do with how you can vet some of those types of professionals and make sure you're getting one that will best meet your needs and is well qualified to assist. So I don't see that we've had any questions come through. I do see I saw the feedback if I could slow down a little bit, and I absolutely am trying to. I'm so sorry, everybody. I get a little nervous and I can speed speak. So if that happens, please let me know. But for now, since we don't have additional questions, we're going to go ahead and keep moving on. Now, very briefly, I do want to touch on financial institutions. We're not going to dwell on this because it's available in some of the other presentation materials that we've had in previous sessions, and specifically the one from July. And I can ask that we share a link to that session as well, because it was recorded with the materials that you get for this one. But it's important to understand what a financial institution is, right? Very simply, it's a company engaged in business of financial and monetary transactions. That sounds so simple. But there's so many different types. There's a broad range of different types of business operations and different types of financial services that exist and then can be called financial institutions, should those entities be helping with these particular items, right? The ones that we're going to focus on today in particular are going to be a little bit more the investment side of things and the banks and credit union side of things, because those are the ones that, one, most of us ask questions about, but two, ultimately are the ones that are going to have the more common type of earnings and gains that we see in relation to our finances as well. So when we start talking about things like savings and earnings and some of the things we need to consider, it's important to know what savings and earnings really are, right? That's the beauty of what compound interest is. It's about making your money do more for you. In most cases, thinking of something like a savings account or a checking account, that's ultimately going to be something that can grow some interest in this fashion, right? The idea here is that the more time you give yourself for things to earn money, the better, right? This example has two different people that start investing at the age of 20, expecting about a 5% rate of return, each at different amounts to get started, one at $50 and one at $150, and they start at zero, equitable, right? And we can see, looking at the snapshots at the bottom of the screen, what happens over time, right? After 10 years, we have a big difference. 50 to 150 doesn't seem all that big, but 7,750 and over $23,000 absolutely does. And that continues in a pattern all the way through to this point where we turn 70, right? Now our person that started off with $50 without doing anything but add $50 and have that 5% rate of return now has 100,000 128,895 in funds, where we have 386,956 on the other side of the conversation. So the idea here is just to kind of show what compound interest does so that we have that in mind when we start thinking about earnings, right? Some of the money that comes to us from the money that we have. So with that in mind, when we think about savings and earnings, really what we're talking about is returns, what our money gave us back, right? There's a couple of different types. First, we have payments, and payments can encompass a broad variety of things like payments from bonds and bank accounts, right? That prior example was a bank account. Dividends, which are just periodic payments from stocks, rent from real estate, royalties and licenses for intellectual property. Those are all earnings, right? That's money that comes into us. Where capital appreciation on the other side of that, that's when something increases in value. So let's say you have, it really can be anything, something like a house if it increases in value, or even a baseball card collection, anything that really could change in value. That still gives us gains. However, they're considered capital gains, okay? And the reason I bring this up is it's important to know that the way that you earn money can have different tax implications. So with that being said, there's a resource here for you that's going to tell you a little bit more about some of those implications and the information that may be helpful to you as you continue on in those conversations. Now, when we think about returns, the other way we can kind of contextualize them is rewards, right? It's the fun stuff that we get for all the work that we're doing, right? Money on money. However, wherever we have rewards in the context of our finances, we probably also have risk, right? And when we think about risk, what it really is, it's just a degree of uncertainty, right? If you don't know what's going to happen, and then the resulting financial loss that could or could not go with it, right? And when we talk about financial losses, it's not just, your money necessarily, right? There's a couple of things that go into our understanding of value. First, our time, right? Anytime we put money away in some type of investment vehicle, what that really does is say we're putting it away for a period of time to let it do that work it was doing in our earlier example, right? So we can certainly do that. On the other side, we have value, right? And value isn't necessarily what you pay today. It's what you might not actually pay today because you decide to wait. That inflation conversation, right? And that ultimately brings us to what opportunity cost is, what you gain or lose by pursuing one option over another. So we want to make sure we think about risk and reward more than just a dollar amount, right? We need to think about it in the context of, what our lives look like, what time we lose or gain by doing something, and the value that it has to us today and tomorrow. Now, very simply, when we think about risk and reward next to each other, it's a correlated relationship. Where we tend to see more risk, we tend to see the opportunity for more reward. Real estate is a good example of this, right? If you were looking to maybe purchase a home in an area that was considered a little bit high risk right now, maybe a developing area, the idea is that there's some risk because you may not either one, be able to sell it, or two, potentially rent it if that's what your goal is. However, on the other side of that, if after time this developing area ultimately does start developing into a place that's seeing a lot of growth and a lot of interest happen, you could potentially see an amplification in what you're getting back on that investment, right? So this really gets into the crux of a very simple example of the risk reward relationship. But the most important thing about it is this conversation's different for everybody, right? You can, giggle a little bit at the pictures on the right-hand side of the screen. I put those together. Gotta love our PowerPoint presentations. But this is supposed to articulate how different people see things, right? Some people have a fantastic idea. They immediately move on it and they're thrilled at the prospect of making money. On the other side of that, again, going back to inflation, we don't necessarily know how comfortable we are doing something because we don't know what will happen tomorrow. And for other people, they're just risk averse all in general. Maybe the idea of making some type of commitment, whether financial or otherwise, is just a little bit scary. So you have to remember your own individual understanding of things, all that cultural influence and the values and beliefs that we have within this context. And that gets into this conversation on self-identity, right? Your dynamic, first and foremost, as people, we change, as do our cultures, our attitudes, and our behaviors, right? Those do not all stay the same over time. And that's because we are influenced by the things around us, and then we influence those things as well. We have to understand those things in the way that they're shaped, right? The best thing that we can do for ourselves is to sit down and really think about that, really understand the way that we're using our money and where our comfort level is on something like risk and reward, right? Somebody can give you advice and tell you that that's what they would do. However, it's got to be okay for you, and you want to make sure that you remember that. Anytime you work with any type of financial professional in particular, they should always be talking about your comfort with risk. You want to make sure that that's something that you're hearing from them so they understand you as a person and what your goals are and what you're hoping to achieve. The other thing to think about too with money and culture and how it shapes our self-identity, there's a lot of influences in culture that we don't always think about immediately, right? First and foremost, economic practices can be incredibly different from country to country. I know that our students are the experts there because you come to us in the United States and New York City in particular and go, this is very different than the world I'm used to. That's because we do it a little differently as you do at home. There's also the difference in understanding individualistic versus collectivist cultures and how you might approach things, right? Some cultures are a little bit less comfortable with help-seeking behaviors. And sometimes we'll see in those cultures that those people have a little bit harder a time with financial literacy. They don't want to ask for help, thinking they should know the answer. And then, of course, the role of the government, your family, and individual financial responsibility can vary significantly based on some of the culture that you're exposed to, right? I know several of my friends growing up were very much, oh, my parents handle the money. My parents handle the money. My parents handle the money. Well, is that advantageous to them today? Nobody can say for sure, right? But that's how it was in their home. My home, that was not the case, right? If I was working, I managed my money and I was responsible for it. And if I didn't have what I needed, I learned a lesson. So we all kind of have to think about those things within the way we understand our worlds. So with that being said, I just wanted to pose the question, and if anybody's willing to share, I am very happy to hear it. What are some of the cultural differences that you've encountered since coming to the university, if you're attending in person? Were they good? Were they bad? Neutral experiences? Anything unexpected or really surprising, or just exactly as you thought it would be? Did you have any assumptions as you were coming into the world? And any examples or experiences to share? And as I do that, please feel free to answer. And I see we did have a question come in related to ITINs, that's tax identification numbers. So as far as going about that process, we actually have a resource available through the International Student Scholars Office that I can share with you as part of the presentation materials that walks you through the process of how you can go about that and some of the considerations that go with it. Now, with that said, I actually have an example that I can share a little bit. And of course, I'm actually from the US. But with that being said, when I think about culture, we also have different cultures here in the US. Even on some of the smallest scales, right? Think about socioeconomic. I grew up in a household that was a little bit low income, right? And we had some financial difficulties as a kid, as I can point out. That's why I think about money the way that I do. However, I then, am now living with my significant other who grew up very much in this area. I grew up in New Jersey. He's from Staten Island. So you wouldn't think there was a whole lot of differences other than our socioeconomic statuses were a little bit different. So with that being said, one of the things I kind of assumed based on my own experiences was that, we had some medical challenges as a family, right? And I have a very good familiarity with what some types of medical equipment are and how some things may come out on a financial scale based on my understanding of insurance for that reason. I remember sitting down and explaining to him this type of x-ray machine that's on the wall, slides up and down, they use it for chest x-rays. And he looked at me like I was speaking, a language he had never heard before because he had no idea that those things existed. And the cost of having something actually, a procedure like that, not that an x-ray is a procedure, but going for that type of a test, whatever it happens to be. So we have to remember those individual circumstances can really shape the way that we work within the world. I made a very unfair assumption in that context that he would absolutely know what I was talking about. He had no idea and still doesn't understand it just because it's a world I grew up in and he didn't. So let's see, before we move on, for international students at Columbia, I think some people think they do not have financial struggles, but they do. There are high costs associated with applying for OPT that are surprising. Yeah, that's a really great point. When we think about our finances, a lot of the time we don't realize necessarily how far we are in on the conversation until we start feeling the stress of it. One of the biggest things I can recommend and hope that you get from this presentation is to be proactive, right? Even though a lot of the things we talk about feel like they're not happening to you today, what you do today can result in those things tomorrow. So preparedness is extraordinarily important. And that's actually where we're starting to move in this conversation. So it was a really great segue. Thank you for that. We're going to talk a little bit about education financing. Okay. One of the questions that come up a lot with our international students is how do I pay for my education, right? We know we hear a lot about federal student aid, and we know that that's something that's not necessarily an opportunity for our international students, but you do have some things that you can do. One of them, of course, is looking at borrowing additional funding. Now, we don't want to encourage that, right? Only borrow if you need to. And the way that you do that is by asking yourself what you really need to borrow, right? First and foremost, how much debt do you currently have and how much are you willing to have, right? We don't come into the world in silos. When you started school with us, there's a chance that you may have some of these things already. And are you willing to make that a larger number if necessary? If so, by how much? On the other side of that, can you afford your payments after school, right? If we ultimately do look at borrowing, we want to make sure that it's reasonable for us to do it, because once we start talking about things like credit, as somebody had asked about much earlier, and building credit being so important, if you wind up not paying your bills when they're due, you can see a really big impact on your credit very quickly. The other side of that is, do you have other things that you can do, right? Not that you don't want to necessarily apply for a loan. If you need it, it's there and it's something you can pursue. And we do talk about that in a couple of moments. But is there something that we can reduce otherwise? Do we have any type of other income streams we can look at utilizing? Things that are really going to make it so that we don't have to borrow more than we have to. And then lastly, thinking about cost benefit analysis. Do you want to borrow it today? Is it worth it to you today to do that? And then again, is it worth it to you tomorrow? Now, the way that we kind of go through that process, and this really speaks to the question that just came through, or the point that came through, I should say, is by really just understanding what our money looks like proactively, right? This is where this concept of spending plans come in. A lot of us are familiar with the word budget and maybe kind of have a negative connotation with it. Good news, this changes what a budget is. Instead of the budget concept being money in, money out today, your spending plan kind of takes that information and then sets a goal for you, right? You want to look at the way your money is going to move in the future and the goals that you hope to achieve, as well as the needs and the resources that you have today and anticipate to have tomorrow. So to do that, you want to start by estimating your projected expenses and income. And in the resource materials that I'll share, I have a couple of really great resources on how you can do that, including some information on the Consumer Price Index, as well as some other anticipated earning information related to your career choice. You also want to make sure, again, to be a little bit of a broken record, that you consider your values, your needs, your wants, your goals, and your financial resources, those things that are specific to you. And then you can use that information to start developing your spending plan, right? Making sure that you meet your current needs first and anything that's coming up immediately. From there, prioritizing your goals, right? By going through and actually tracking how much money you have coming in versus coming out, you can take things that you want and plan for them. So anytime we have wants, we turn them into goals by doing that. There's a few different methods for doing that. One of the ones that I share with my students is a SMART goal setting method, which just means that you're setting goals that are specific, measurable, attainable, or achievable, realistic, and time-based, right? So they have to have a metric that you can measure. You have to be able to tell all the details that you need to be able to complete this goal. You want to make sure that it's something that's reasonable. That's why we have to go through and see the expenses that can be associated with it. And again, how much we have available to us. And you have to put an end date on it. It is so important. It seems easy when we have goals that may be a little bit ambiguous to say, okay, well, I'll get there eventually. Eventually isn't specific enough, unfortunately. When we have goals that don't have end dates, they're very, very easy to keep pushing off. They're not important to us. We can always adjust, right? If we have a goal that has an end date and we're getting there and it's not realistic anymore, then we change it, but we still give it an end date, right? And there's a lot of different platforms that you can use to your benefit to try and assess some of this information and start planning for your goals, which are some of what we're going to go through in a moment. But after going through that process, the last step is actually looking at what you found out, right? You have to assess, reflect on the information in front of you, and be prepared to adjust. Anytime we talk about budgeting or spending plans, it's cyclical, but it's repetitive, right? You don't get to the end, unfortunately, and you're done with the marathon. It's something we have to do over and over. For that reason, it's so important to have the right tools available to do it. And that's some of what else you're seeing here on the screen. First, on the top right-hand side, this is iGrad's Your Budget tool. It's a dynamic tool that lets you put a lot of really good information related to your budget into it. It also lets you change and add your goals right there in the tool. So if I had a goal that I wanted to earn, set aside a savings, an emergency savings plan for, let's say, $5,000, and I want to do that in the next 4 years, I put my timeline in, I put the amount of money I'm hoping to get, and it adds the amount I need every month right into my budget. And it's very visual. If you have money left over in your budget, you will see a green number on the analysis side of things. And if you don't, it turns red. So if something turned red, you need to make a change. Really, really simple. The other tools that are available there, they have what they call their daily income and expense diary. And this is great if you've never actually gone through the process of tracking your income and expenses. It's actually got a separate day for each day of a 30-day month to let you go ahead and put what money came in and what money went out in several different categories, whether it's income, whether it's a student loan payment, or a student loan payment to you for your expenses, tuition being due, whatever it happens to be. And at the end of the month, you get a pie chart that shows you kind of where your expenses were, so you can evaluate it really quickly. And it also gives you details of some of your spending and what the totals and aggregate are of what your costs are. And as a partner document to that, they have another tool where you can use that same information, put it into it for each month that you're ultimately tracking for, right? And then you can see what you actually planned on spending, what you did spend, and use that to potentially make adjustments. For some of us, we prefer to kind of do things on the phone. I tried to do that myself. This is actually a point I like to make. Sometimes if we're not doing terribly well with trying to assess our spending plan, it might just be the tool that we're using, right? You don't want to go, this is what I have to use because I was told this exists. You want to try it out. And if it doesn't work, see if something else does. For me, trying to use financial technology or fintech, I found myself seeing my phone and watch it vibrate and just pushing it to the side with every other text notification that I get. I'm not good at checking it. So that doesn't do it for me. I have to be a little bit more intentional, sit down and evaluate. So I tend to use some of the tools that are in iGrad myself to do that. You can also look at other software programs. If you're the type of person that likes to be very literal, there's something called the back of the envelope method. You write things down on an envelope, you put the money in it, and that's what you have for that period of time. That's really good if you have trouble kind of visualizing where your money's going. So the whole point being there's a plethora of resources available to you to do that. And just to trust yourself in knowing that maybe it's not you. Maybe we just need to adjust and try a different tool. Now, beyond that, we also want to make sure before we take any type of student loan or approach one, that we're looking for some of those things that we don't have to pay back first, right? And there's a couple different types of non-repayable fund sources, which this resource is providing to you. It has definitions for what scholarships are, as well as work study, assistantships, fellowships, sponsorships, and if you have employer assistance programs. And there's a fantastic course available in iGrad that can teach you a little bit more about searching and vetting scholarship opportunities as well. However, this brings me to the best tool in iGrad for the vast majority of our students when they first get started with us. This is actually iGrad's scholarship search engine. Now, the way that this is designed to work is once you create your account, and again, you do that just by going to columbia.igrad.com and signing up with your school email address, you'll be able to utilize this scholarship tool to kind of look in one place for several different opportunities. So you can see kind of on the left-hand side of the screen, it's got this nice list that you can kind of sort and filter to your benefit. It also, when you find an opportunity you're interested in applying for, lets you open the individual opportunity and shows you the details about that opportunity right here instead of having to go to several different websites to try and find that information. And additionally, the people at iGrad actually maintain, monitor, and quality control this particular resource. So the information that's here is well vetted and current. And then lastly, it also lets you filter by multiple different criteria. Two of the most popular ones that we see are school type, because it will let you, let's say if you're a graduate student, choose graduate school, or if you're going for your undergrad, you can choose that. And we also have the capability to choose whether or not we want citizenship to be required, right? So for our international students, you can choose the option that says that U.S. citizenship is not required or international residency is required, and that will show you opportunities that make the most sense for you, okay? So this is a really fantastic tool that's going to be linked in the resources that you have. I strongly encourage you to go take a look at it and see what opportunities might be there for you. So I don't see that we've had any other questions come through. I'm going to push forward in the interest of time. Continuing on, we're going to talk a little bit more about just educational financing, right? There's a couple other resources that can help you kind of plan for some of your costs. We talked a little bit about how to approach the inflation side of things, but how do we know what things actually should kind of look like when we get here? This is some of the tools that are available to you to do that. On the left-hand side of the screen is just a snapshot of what our International Student Financial Aid website looks like. So you have an idea where that is and where it looks, what it looks like if you choose to visit. However, that site has several different things. It talks a little bit about cost of attendance, which is just a projection of what your costs may be at school for a period of time. And it talks more than just your tuition and fees, right? There's also approximations for things like your personal or miscellaneous expenses, your living expenses, and it's generally related to a 9-month school year when we most often see students in school. So you can use that to kind of approximate what some of those costs are. In addition to that, there's information here on some of the opportunities that are available to our students that are looking to use some type of lending to finance their education. First, we have a snapshot of our suggested lender list, which is available to you through Elm is the name of the site. You do not have to use a lender from this list. We encourage you to pursue any lender that best meets your needs and your qualifications, or any financial institution that meets your needs, but this is a resource that's available to you as well. When you go to this website, which again is going to be linked in the resource materials, you're going to go ahead and open up that particular site. There's one specific for international students. You choose your grade level, and it provides a bunch of different lending options that you may ultimately choose to pursue. You can also filter that information as to whether or not it requires a cosigner, which is really, really helpful. We know that's a question that comes up a lot. And it also then can open things up and actually show you the exact information related to these loans, including some of the things that are most important to evaluate when deciding what loan makes the most sense for you. See, we had a question pop through. Are these resources, i.e. iGrad, guaranteeing privacy of information? Yes, that is a great question. So the information that you provide to iGrad, your account, your name and your email address, things like that, if you choose to use the budgeting tools that are in there, it is not sent to anybody. That is your information for use explicitly with your account in the platform. So it's not shared with any third-party vendors or anything along those lines. Great question. So one of the other important points just to touch on, and I know we had some credit questions earlier, when we start talking about private loans for international students, we are starting the credit conversation, right? Most lenders evaluate your credit to determine your eligibility to borrow, which is why we do see a lot of questions related to credit. However, not always, right? There are some lending opportunities out there that they look at other criteria or jointly look at criteria in addition to credit. We did a lot of conversation related to that in our last session, so I'm going to share the resources for you with the credit information related to that so that you have it. And of course, if any questions come up, one, the presentation will be available online, but two, you can always reach out to me. My contact information is going to be there as well. Now, I mentioned on that lender list, again, not that you have to use it, but that they have kind of some really good information about what you may potentially want to look at when you're comparing lending offers, right? This is some of the snapshots directly from there. You'll see they talk a little bit about what your interest rate or your annual percentage rate might be, which is very similar to interest rate, not exactly the same, but very similar, where interest rate is just the amount that they charge you in interest. Makes sense. Annual percentage rate also accounts for the fact that interest accumulates over time. And it also accounts for the fact that there may be other things you're paying for, whether that happens to be an annual fee or some other type of service with the card. You'll also see that it talks a lot about things that kind of relate to variable interest rates, right? That's why you're seeing this variance in rates that are here. Most lenders have options that are variable or fixed. Variable just means it's going to fluctuate over time, and it's related to market stuff and index stuff. Where on the other side of that, if you have a fixed rate, it will not change based on those conditions. It's what it is and what it is and what it is. You'll also see it talks about some of the repayment terms here. Those are always important, so you understand roughly how long you may have to pay things back, or if you have questions, or if you might need something a little different. And they'll list things like benefits and fees as well. A lot of private lenders will do an interest rate reduction, for example, if you do auto payment. So you'll see that there's an example like that here. More important than anything is what you're seeing towards the middle bottom of the screen, that disclosure section, right? So as a borrower of US credit, anytime you apply, you are entitled to, in private loans in particular, certain disclosures of information before ever accepting a loan. And it's a requirement to you that you have that information. Some of this will include things like approximate repayment information. It'll include disclosures for you. And in the case of private loans, you'll ultimately see it 3 times. You get a lot of paper. The first time is average information, just to show you. The second time is after you've been, pre-approved or approved for a loan and what your actual terms and information look like. And then the last one comes before the money gets sent directly to the school for you. This way you can just go, yep, no, I'm sure that's what I want. And this is all part of something that's called TILA, the Truth in Lending Act. And the resource that's available on the screen, which is actually linked on the right-hand side, is to information regarding that. So you can see what information you're entitled to in such a circumstance. Now, we talked a lot about iGrad today. What iGrad again is, it's just the university's complimentary financial literacy platform that's available to you both now and after you leave school. So if you create your account today, that's your account as long as iGrad exists. And the vast majority of the information for this presentation was built from materials in iGrad, whether that's the courses that are available, which have pre and post assessments, whether that's based on the articles that are there, the videos that are there. I personally really like the infographics. I tend to start start by learning about things very visually. So having that kind of snapshot information is helpful for me. But you'll see this spans a lot of different content types and a lot of different topical areas. Of course, we see things related to student aid because we are talking to students, but at the same time, there's information on consumer finances here. I was really fascinated by the health insurance and medical insurance information that was available because we don't always think about that in the context of our finances. But again, what does insurance do? Protect us from risk. And we talked about risk today for that reason, right? It's just a different kind of risk. It's stuff that we kind of pay to protect ourselves from. There's things related to all sorts of different topics there. And most recently, they added money mindfulness information, which I absolutely love. It gives you a chance to do things where you're thinking a little bit more about the behavioral side of how you engage with your finances, which can often get forgotten. So to assist students with navigating the platform, the QR code that you're seeing on the screen here will take you directly to a video of navigating the platform. It looks longer than it is. It says it's 30 minutes, but there are a couple of minute snippets each piece, so you don't have to go through everything all at once. And again, you'll be asked to log in with your university network ID, your uni, and you can access that as well. Now, to that end, I don't have any other material scheduled for us to chat through. However, there's going to be a plethora of resources made available to you, including a way for you to let us know, one, how we did, and two, what we can do next, right? The most important thing for us is always to make sure that we're best serving your needs. And the only way that we can do that is to make sure that you share your thoughts with us. So please do that. And if there's anything that we can still touch on for you or you have questions, my contact information is listed at the middle of the screen, financialwellness@columbia.edu. That comes directly to me. So you'll be chatting with me at that point. And there's some other resources listed here for you as well. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and see if we have any other questions. I don't see that we do. With that said, I do believe that wraps us up for the day. I want to thank everybody for being here. Again, this is recorded and will be sent out in approximately the next 2 weeks or so, probably earlier, most of the time it is. If you have any questions after having seen this session and getting materials, please let us know. But for now, I am going to go ahead and say thank you and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you, everybody.